My family lives in a semi-detached house. We share the whole house with the Murphy family. My parents have known the family even before I was born. Mr. and Mrs. Murphy were a nice couple, and I always felt as if they were my own family. I would often go across the porch to Mrs. Murphy's house to have her special cupcakes. Mr. and Mrs. Murphy were a couple in their mid-40s. They didn't have any children. I guess that's why they were very fond of me. Growing up, Mrs. Murphy took a lot of care of me. My mother used to leave me at her place when she used to go out to run some errands. Mrs. Murphy would tell me all kinds of stories to keep me occupied and not crying for my mother. I grew to like the woman and would prefer to stay at her house rather than follow my mom to the groceries. Mr. Murphy also didn't mind having me over at the house so often. Although whenever I'm in the house, I've always seen Mr. and Mrs. Murphy as a lovey-dovey, perfect, happy couple, I've realized it may not have been so lovey-dovey all the time. Since we lived in a semi-detached house, we shared the same wall that ran through the middle of the whole building. I would often hear what was going on in the Murphy household, like the time when Mr. Murphy would be singing Happy Birthday in the worst voice I've ever heard. He doesn't know how to sing, but he often does it. Or the time when Mr. Murphy cooked food that tastes like crap when Mrs. Murphy was sick, but she still had it and pretended it was the best food she'd ever tasted. I heard Mrs. Murphy vomiting in the bathroom that day. Or other awkward times when I would overhear the two fighting about their marital lives. Both Mr. and Mrs. Murphy desperately wanted a child, but as things obviously hadn't worked the way they wanted, I would hear the two blaming each other about the whole matter. The two would enjoy having me over because it filled up the gap they felt of not having a child of their own. They treated me like the son they never had. One day, I heard someone knocking the door. I opened up and saw it was Mrs. Murphy. She looked happier than ever. She carried a huge cake in her hands and stepped inside. "Where's your mother? I have good news to share with her." When I called my mother, Mrs. Murphy took her to the kitchen. I overheard the two laughing and giggling as they served up the cake on plates. Mrs. Murphy was expecting a child. I thought it was a little weird because she was quite elderly and I didn't know how to behave. I felt quite awkward. She couldn't stop talking about this new herbal mixture that she had been taking. "I'm telling you, Diana, you should take it too. I feel at least 10 years younger after drinking it in the morning." "Oh really? Where did you get it?" Mr. and Mrs. Murphy had been gathering with a few people across the town. She said they would all meditate and bond with the nature. They finally understood what air was, how to breathe it. She had been doing it wrong all this time. She took deep, long breaths and asked my mother to follow her and do it. The people over there were experts on plant life, and they had the secrets to nature's medication. They could heal any disease with all natural solutions. She had told them that she was struggling to get pregnant. They offered her a special mixture, and she's been having it for a few months now. Some of the other women there were also taking it, and they all praised how well it worked, and how good it made them feel. But the solution wasn't only just for women, it was for men too, and she had been making Mr. Murphy take it as well. I could sense that my mother was becoming interested about Mrs. Murphy's concoction. But I could really care less what women do on their free time. I left the two alone and went up to my room. My mother stays at home. She gets the family breakfast ready early in the morning before we all leave for school or work. She has the day to herself after that until my father and I come back home. Recently, every time I would be back from home, my mother would still be in the kitchen just starting to make food for us. I'd have to wait a whole hour before she could serve me lunch. She would then hurry around the house to finish up all the other chores. What was strange is that I've never seen the house a mess, and I've never actually waited for Mother to make food for me. She always had things done ahead of time, so we wouldn't be late for anything. The next weekend, I realized my mother had been going with Mrs. Murphy to that place she spoke about. She would be out the whole day, coming back right before I did, so she didn't have anything ready for me by the time I came back home. I have a whole lot of work to do after I come home. I study most of the time, and other times I go out to the field to play football with some friends. I didn't go over to Mrs. Murphy's place as often as I used to when I was younger. And now that she was pregnant, I felt a little awkward around her. Whenever I saw her around, she would be talking about something related to childbirth classes. Mrs. Murphy was a little chubby to begin with, and that wasn't any surprise since she wouldn't stop baking sweet treats and sending it over across to our house. Things went on like this for quite a few months when I met Mrs. Murphy by the porch one day when I was coming back home. She stood there smiling at me. "The baby's going to be here anytime soon now. Aren't you excited to meet the fella?" "Yeah, sure, I guess." I smiled and hurried to enter the house and avoid getting into an awkward talk with Mrs. Murphy. That's when I noticed that Mrs. Murphy looked the same as she did 7 months ago. She didn't look pregnant at all. Whatever it was, I didn't bother and quickly went inside. When I went inside, I found my mother offering my father something to drink. When I sat down on the table, I realized she was offering the same herbal thing that Mr. and Mrs. Murphy were having. My parents were having it too. I had no clue what exactly the thing was. The next time I went to the field to play some ball, I mentioned it to a couple of my friends. They were a bit shocked to find out. They all told me they had noticed it as well, and had heard their parents talking about some herbal juice. Some of them even said that their parents were using it. We figured it was the new trend in the town. Everyone was doing it. That day, when I returned home, Mrs. Murphy was on the porch again. She waved at me and said, "Hello, Jimmy." I smiled and walked past her. When I got to the living room, I saw something that disturbed me. My mother was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV and laughing. All was fine, except the TV wasn't turned on. Yet she was looking at it and laughing. No one else was in the room. When she heard my footsteps, she turned her head and said, "You're back home, Jimmy?" I could feel my heart pulsing in my throat. I thought perhaps Mrs. Murphy could make a mistake, but my mother? "My name is Jamie." I nervously walked towards the dining table. I looked into the kitchen. My father was stirring something on the stove. I asked him, "Is everything okay?" My father looked up. He was smiling from ear to ear. He said, "Everything is fine, Jimmy. Why do you ask?" A cold wave ran through my body. My name is Jamie. Without a word, I quickly walked up to my room and locked the door. My mother was still smiling at me when I was walking up the stairs. I had no idea what was going on. I stayed in my room and tried to think. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong with my family. I heard my parents walk up the stairs and go into their room. I gathered some courage and went to spy on them. As I walked near their door and peered inside, I saw my father drinking water. I was about to step inside when I noticed he wasn't putting the bottle down. He finished the whole bottle in a single breath, only to pick up another one that was placed on the table. As a matter of fact, there was a whole carton of bottles stacked to one side of the room. Was it water or was it something else? I watched as my father emptied out bottle after bottle without a single pause. The door suddenly creaked, and my father spotted me watching. I ran down the stairs and out the front door. As I was dashing down the sidewalk, I looked back and saw my father chasing after me like a mad dog on his hands and feet. Soon, my mother and Mr. and Mrs. Murphy ran out the front yard on all four and headed my way. I've been on the run since that day. I keep moving from place to place, but I haven't gotten far on foot. I managed to get some spare change from begging on the street. I bought some water with it. I don't know what happened to my parents. I don't know what happened to Mrs. Murphy. I have a feeling it was because of that herbal mixture Mrs. Murphy had brought over. I have a feeling Mrs. Murphy wasn't even pregnant. She had just gone mad hallucinating about it. I went to the police, but they didn't believe me. They tried to take me back to my parents, thinking I was a silly runaway kid. I nearly got caught again, but I managed to escape by asking to go to the bathroom. I'm not in my neighborhood anymore. I tried talking to a reporter here, but he just looked at me as if I was a freak. I'm too afraid to go back home. I don't know what's going on there. Can anyone help me? My name is Jimmy. Click on the subscribe button and check out more awesome videos on our channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon because you know it's interesting.